In some ways, he resembled Ranjit's lepers, but his wounds were so raw and bloody, and the teeth were so smashed. The second wounded man had taken a blast in the face and throat. His eyes were destroyed, and most of the nose and mouth were gone. In some ways, he resembled Ranjit's lepers, but his wounds were so raw and bloody, and the teeth were so smashed, that Ranjit's disfigurements seemed benign in comparison. I took the metal pieces from his eyes and his scalp and his throat. The wounds at his throat were bad, and although he was breathing fairly evenly, my guess was that his condition would worsen. After dressing his wounds, I gave both men a shot of penicillin and an ampule of morphine. My biggest problem was blood, and the need to replace what the wounded men had lost. Not one of the Mujahideen fighters I'd asked during the last weeks had known his own or anyone else's blood type. Thus it was impossible for me to blood match the men, or to build up a bank of donors. Because my own blood type was O, which is known as the universal donor type, my body was the only source of blood for transfusions, and I was the walking blood bank for the whole combat unit. Typically, a donor provides about half a liter of blood in a session. The body holds about 6 liters, so the blood lost in donation amounts to less than 1/10 of the body's supply. I put a little more than half a liter into each of the wounded men, rigging up the intravenous drips that Kader had brought with him as part of his smuggled cargo. I wondered whether the equipment had come from Ranjit and his lepers as I tapped my veins and those of the wounded fighters with needles that were stored in loose containers rather than sealed packets. The transfusions took nearly 20% of my blood. It was too much. I felt dizzy and faintly nauseous, unsure if they were real symptoms or simply the slithering tricks of my fear. I knew that I wouldn't be able to give more blood for some time, and the hopelessness of the situation, mine and theirs, crushed my chest with a flush and spasm of anguish. It was dirty, frightening work, and I wasn't trained for it. The first aid course that I'd completed as a young man had been comprehensive, but it hadn't covered combat injuries. And the work I'd done at my clinic in the slum was little help in those mountains. Beyond that, I was running on instinct, the same instinct to help and heal that had compelled me to save overdosed heroin addicts in my own city a lifetime before. It was, of course, in great part a secret wish, like Khalid, with the vicious madman Habib, to be helped and saved and healed myself. And though it wasn't much, and it wasn't enough, it was all I had. So I did my best, trying not to vomit or cry or show my fear, and then I washed my hands in the snow. When Nazir was sufficiently recovered, he insisted on burying Abdul Qadir Khan with the strictest adherence to ritual. He did that before he ate a meal or even drank a glass of water. I watched as Khalid, Mahmud, and Nazir cleaned themselves, prayed together, and then prepared Qadirbai's body for burial. His green and white standard was lost, but one of the Mujahideen provided his own flag as a shroud. On a simple white background, it carried the phrase, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. Mahmud Melbaf, the Iranian who'd been with us since the Karachi taxi ride, was so tender and devoted and loving in his ministrations that my eyes went again and again to his calm, strong face as he worked and prayed. If he'd been burying his own child, he couldn't have been more gentle or clement, and it was from those moments during the burial that I began to cherish him as a friend. I caught Nazir's eye at the end of the ceremony, and at once I dropped my face to stare at the frozen ground beside my boots. He was in a wilderness of grieving and sorrowing shame. He'd lived to protect and serve Qadir Khan. But the Khan was dead, and he was alive. Worse than that, he wasn't even wounded. His own life, the mere fact of his existence in the world, seemed like a betrayal. Every heartbeat was a new act of treachery. And that grief and his exhaustion took such a toll on him that he was quite seriously ill. He looked as much as 10 kilos lighter. His cheeks were hollow, and there were black troughs beneath his eyes. His lips were cracked and peeling. His hands and feet worried me. I'd examined them, and I knew that the color and warmth hadn't fully returned to them. I thought he might have suffered frostbite in his crawl through the snow. There was, in fact, a task that did give his life purpose at that time, if not meaning, but I didn't know that then. Qadirbai had given a last instruction, a last duty to perform, in the event of his death during the mission. He'd named a man, and ordered Nazir to kill him. Nazir was following that instruction even then, simply by staying alive long enough to carry out the murder. It was what sustained him, and his whole life had shrunk to that forlorn obsession. Knowing nothing of that then, As the cold days after Kader's burial became colder weeks, I worried constantly for the tough, loyal Afghan's sanity. Khalid Ansari was changed by Kader's death in ways that were less obvious but equally profound. Where many of us were shocked into a dull, dense attention to routines, Khalid became sharper and more energetic. Where I often found myself adrift in stunned, heartbroken, bittersweet meditations on the man we'd loved and lost, Khalid took on new jobs almost every day, and never lost his focus. As a veteran of several wars, he assumed Qadarbai's role of advisor to the Mujahideen commander Suleiman Shabadi. In all his deliberations, the Palestinian was intense and tireless and judicious, to the point of being solemn. They weren't new qualities for Khalid. He was ever a dour, fervent man. But there was in him, after Kader's death, a hopefulness and a will to win that I'd never seen before. And he prayed. From the day we buried the Khan, Khalid was the first to call the men to prayer, and the last to lift his knees from the frozen stone. Suleiman Shabadi, the most senior Afghan left in our group, there were 20 of us, including the wounded, was a former community leader, or Kandidar, from a clutch of villages near Ghazni, 2/3 of the way to Kabul. He was 52 years old and a 5-year veteran of the war. He was experienced in all forms of combat, from siege to guerrilla skirmish to pitched battle. Ahmed Shah Massoud, the unofficial leader of the nationwide war to expel the Russians, had personally appointed Suleiman to set up the southern commands near Kandahar. All the men in our ethnically eclectic unit felt such awestruck admiration for Massoud that it wasn't too strong to call it a kind of love. And because Suleiman's commission had come directly from Massoud, the lion of the Panjshir, the men gave him an equally reverential respect. When Nazir was well enough to give a full report, just 3 days after we'd found him in the snow, Suleiman Shabadi called a meeting. He was a short man with big hands and feet, and a sorrowful expression. 7 lines and ridges like planters' furrows creased his broad, high brow. A thickly coiled white turban covered his bald head. The dark, gray beard was trimmed around the mouth, and cut short beneath the jaw. His ears were slightly pointed, an effect that was exaggerated against the white turban, and that puckish touch combined with his wide mouth to hint at the cheeky humor that once might have been his. But then, on the mountain, his face was dominated by the expression in his eyes. They were the eyes of an unutterable sadness, a sadness withered and emptied of tears. It was an expression that engaged our sympathy yet prevented us from befriending him. For all that he was a wise, brave, and kindly man, that sadness was so deep in him that no man risked its touch. With 4 sentries at their posts around the camp, and 2 men wounded, there were 14 of us gathered in the cave to hear Suleiman speak. It was extremely cold, at or below 0, and we sat together to share our warmth. I wished that I'd been more assiduous in my study of Dari and Pashto during the long wait in Quetta. Men spoke in both languages at that meeting, and everyone after it. Mahmoud Melbaf translated the Dari into Arabic for Khalid, who transformed the Arabic into English, leaning first to his left to listen to Mahmoud, and then leaning right as he whispered to me. It was a long, slow process, and I was amazed and humbled that the men waited patiently for every exchange to be translated for me. The popular European and American caricature of Afghans as wild, bloodthirsty men, a description that delighted Afghans themselves endlessly when they heard it, was contradicted by every direct contact I had with them. Face to face, Afghan men were generous, friendly, honest, and scrupulously courteous to me. I didn't say anything at that first meeting, or at any of those that followed, but still the men included me in every word they shared. Nazir's report on the attack that had killed our Khan was alarming. Kader had left the camp with 26 men, and all the riding and pack horses, on what should have been a safe passage route to the village of his birth. On the second day of the march, still a full day and night from Qadarbai's village, they were forced to stop for what they thought was a routine tribute exchange with a local clan leader. There were hard questions asked about Habib Abdur Rahman at the meeting. In the 2 months since he'd left us, after killing poor, unconscious Siddiqui, Habib had instituted a one-man war of terror in what was for him a new area of operations, the Shar-i-Safa mountain range. He'd tortured a Russian officer to death. He'd dealt similar justice, as he saw it, to Afghan army men, and even Mujahideen fighters whom he judged to be less than fully committed to the cause. The horrors of those tortures had succeeded in nailing terror to everyone in the region. It was said that he was a ghost, or the shaitan, the great Satan himself, come to rend men's bodies and peel the masks of their human faces back from their very skulls. What had been a relatively quiet corridor between the war zones was suddenly a turmoil of angry, terrified soldiers and other fighters, all pledged to find and kill the demon Habib. Realizing that he was in a trap designed to capture Habib, and that the men surrounding him were hostile to his cause, Qadrbay tried to leave peacefully. He surrendered 4 horses as a tribute and gathered his men. They were almost free of the enemy high ground when the first shots rattled into the little canyon. The battle raged for half an hour. When it was over, Nazir counted 18 bodies from Qadar's column. Some of them had been killed as they lay wounded. Their throats had been cut. Nazir and Ahmedzadeh had only survived because they were crushed in a tangle of bodies, of horses and men, and appeared to be dead. One horse had survived the encounter with a serious wound. Nazir roused the animal, and strapped Qadar's dead body and Ahmed's dying one to its back. The horse trudged through the snow for a day and half a night before it crumpled, collapsed, and died almost 3 kilometers from our camp. Nazir then dragged both bodies through the snow until we found him. He had no idea what had happened to the 5 men who were not accounted for from Qadar's column. They might have escaped, he thought, or they might have been captured. One thing was certain. Among the enemy dead, Nazir had seen Afghan army uniforms and some new Russian equipment. Suleiman and Khalid Ansari assumed that the mortar attack on our position was linked to the battle that had claimed Abdul Qadar's life. They guessed that the Afghan army unit had regrouped and, perhaps following Nazir's trail, or acting on information gouged from prisoners, they'd launched the mortar attack. Suleiman assumed that there would be more attacks, but he doubted that they would launch a full frontal assault on the position. Such an attack would cost many lives, and mightn't succeed. If Russian soldiers supported the Afghan army units, however, there might be helicopter attacks as soon as the sky was clear enough. Either way, we would lose men. Eventually, we might lose the high ground altogether. After much discussion of the limited options open to us, Suleiman decided to launch 2 counter-attacks with mortar units of our own. To that end, we needed reliable information about the enemy positions and their relative strength. He began to brief a young Hazarbuz nomad named Jalalad for the scouting mission, but then he froze, staring at the mouth of the cave. We all turned and gaped in surprise at the wild, ragged silhouette of a man in the oval frame of light at the opening of the cave. It was Habib. He'd slipped into the camp unseen by the sentries, an enigmatically difficult task, and he stood with us, 2 short steps away. I'm glad to say I wasn't the only one who reached for a weapon. Khalid rushed forward with such a wide and heartfelt smile that I resented it, and resented Habib more for inspiring it. He brought the madman into the cave and sat him down beside the startled Suleiman. And then, with perfect calm and clarity, Habib began to speak. He'd seen the enemy positions, he said, and he knew their strength. He'd watched the mortar attack on our camp, and then he'd crept down to their camps, so close that he'd heard them decide what to eat for lunch. He could guide us to new vantage points where we could fire mortars into their camps, and kill them. Those who didn't die outright, he wanted it understood, belonged to him. That was his price. The men debated Habib's proposal, speaking openly in front of him. It worried some that we were putting ourselves in the hands of the very lunatic whose monstrous tortures had brought the war to our cave. It was bad luck to link ourselves to his evil, those men said, bad morals and bad luck. It worried others that we would kill so many Afghan army regulars. One of the seemingly bizarre contradictions of the war was that Afghan met Afghan with real reluctance and sincerely regretted every death. There was such a long history of division and conflict between the clans and ethnic divisions in Afghanistan that no man, with the exception of Habib, truly hated the Afghans who fought on the side of the Russians. Real hatred, where it existed at all, was reserved for the Afghan version of the KGB, known as the KAD. The Afghan traitor Najibullah, who eventually seized power and appointed himself ruler of the country, headed that infamous police force for years, and was responsible for many of its unspeakable tortures. There wasn't a resistance fighter in the country who didn't dream of dragging on a rope and hoisting him into the air by his neck. The soldiers and even the officers of the Afghan army, however, were a different matter. They were kinsmen, many of them conscripts, doing what they had to do in order to survive. And for their part, The Afghan regulars often sent vital information concerning Russian troop movements or bombardments to Mujahideen fighters. In fact, the war could never be won without their secret help. And a surprise mortar attack on the two Afghan army positions, identified by Habib, would cost many Afghan lives. The long discussion ended with a decision to fight. Our situation was judged to be so perilous that we had no choice but to counterattack and drive the enemy from the mountain. The plan was good, and it should have worked, but like so much else in that war, it brought only chaos and death. 4 sentries remained to guard the camp, and I stayed behind as well to care for the wounded. The 14 men of the strike force were divided into 2 teams. Khalid and Habib led the first team, Suleiman led the second. Following Habib's directions, they set up their mortars about a kilometer away from the enemy camps, a distance that was well inside the maximum effective range. The bombardment commenced just after dawn and continued for half an hour. The strike teams found 8 Afghan soldiers when they entered the ruined camps. Not all of them were dead. Habib went to work on the survivors. Sickened by what they'd agreed to let him do, our men returned to the camp, hoping never to see the madman again. Less than 1 hour after their return, a counter-bombardment rained on our compound with whining, whistling, thumping explosions. As the deadly attack subsided, we crawled from our hiding places to hear a strange, vibrating hum. Khalid was a few meters away from me. I saw the fear rasp across his scarred face. He began to run toward the small cover provided by clefts in the rock walls opposite the caves. He was shouting and waving for me to join him. I took a step towards him and then froze as a Russian helicopter rose like some huge, monstrous insect over the rim of the compound. It's impossible to describe how immense and predatory those machines seem when you're under fire from them. The monster fills the eye and the mind, and for a second or two there seems to be nothing else in the world but the metal and the noise and the terror. In the instant that it appeared, it fired on us and wheeled away like a falcon falling to the kill. 2 rockets scorched the air as they streaked toward the caves. They traveled with incredible speed, much faster than my eyes could follow. I swung round to see one rocket smash into the stone cliff above the entrance to the cave complex and explode with a shower of smoke, flame, rock, and metal fragments. Immediately after it, the second rocket entered the cave mouth and exploded. The shock wave that hit me was a physical thing, like standing on the edge of a swimming pool and having someone push me in with the flat of his hands. I slammed onto my back and gasped, choking for air, with the wind knocked out of me. I could see the entrance to the caves. The wounded men were in there. Other men were hiding in there. Bursting through the black smoke and flames, men began running or crawling out of the cave. One of the men was a Pashtun trader named Alif. He'd been a favorite of Qadarbai's for his jokes and irreverent satires of pompous mullahs and local political figures. His back was blown out from the head to the thighs. His clothes were on fire. They burned and smoldered around the bare, erupted meat of his back. Bones, a hip bone and a shoulder blade, were clearly visible and moving in the open wound as he crawled. He was screaming out for help. I gritted my teeth to make the run to him, but the helicopter appeared again. It roared past us at great speed, twice turning in tight circles to attack us from new angles in passing rushes. Then it hovered with arrogant, fearless nonchalance near the edge of the plateau that had been our haven. Just as I started to move forward, it fired 2 more rockets at the caves and then another 2. The salvo lit up the whole interior of the cavern for an instant, and melted the snow with a rolling fireball of flames and white-hot metal pieces. One fragment landed only an arm's reach away from me. It crashed into the snow and sizzled with a blistering hiss for several seconds. I crawled away after Khalid, and squeezed my body into the narrow cleft in the rocks. The gunship opened up with machine guns, raking the open ground and chopping up the bodies of the wounded men who were exposed there. Then I heard another gun with a different tone, and I realized that one of our men was firing back at the helicopter. It was the sound of a PK, one of our Russian machine guns, returning fire. It was quickly followed by a second, long chun-chun-chun-chun burst from another PK. 2 of our men were firing at the helicopter. My only instinct had been to hide myself from the ruthlessly efficient killing machine, but they not only exposed themselves to the beast, they actually challenged it and drew its fire. There was a shout from somewhere behind me, and then a rocket fizzed past my hideaway cleft in the stone toward the chopper. It was a rocket, fired from an AK-74 by one of our men. It missed the helicopter, and so did the next 2 rockets, but the return fire from our men was finding its target, and convinced the pilot to cut his losses and leave. A great shout went up from our men, "Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!" Khalid and I eased our way out of the wedge of stone to find 4 men rushing forward and firing at the aircraft. A thin stream of rusty black smoke dribbled from a point about 2/3 of the way along the length of the machine as it plunged away from us, to the metal screech of a wildly racing engine. The young man who'd opened up the counterattack was Jalalad, the Hazerbuz nomad. He handed the heavy PK off to a friend, snatched up an AK-74 with a taped double magazine, and bounded away in search of enemy soldiers who might have crept close under cover of the chopper. 2 other young men ran after him, slipping and jumping down the snow-covered slope. We searched the compound for survivors. We were 20 men at the start of the attack, including our 2 wounded. After it, we were 11, Jalalad and the 2 young men, Juma and Hanif, who'd left with him to find any Afghan regulars or Russians within our defensive perimeter, Khalid, Nazir, a very young fighter named Alauddin, 3 wounded men, Suleiman, and myself. We'd lost 9 men, 1 more than the 8 Afghan army men we'd killed in our mortar attack on them. Our wounded were in a bad way. One man was so badly burned that his fingers had fused together like a crab's claws, and his face wasn't recognizably human. He was breathing through a hole in the red skin of his face. It might have been his mouth, that trembling hole in his face, but there was no way to be sure. The breaths were labored, scraping sounds that faded and weakened as I listened to them. I gave him morphine and moved on to the next man. He was a farmer from Ghazni named Zahra Rasul. He'd taken to bringing me green tea whenever I read a book or made notes in my journal. He was a kindly, self-effacing 42-year-old, a senior man in a country where the average lifespan for men was 45. His arm was missing below the shoulder. The same projectile, whatever it was, that had severed his arm, had torn him open along his body, from the chest to the hip, on the right-hand side. There was no way of knowing what pieces of metal or stone might be lodged inside his wounds. He was praying a repetitive zikir. God is great. God forgive me. God is merciful. God forgive me. Mahmoud Melbaf was holding a tourniquet on the ragged stump of shoulder that remained. When he released it, the blood spattered us in strong warm spurts. Mahmoud pulled the tourniquet tight once more. I looked into his eyes. "Artery," I said, crushed by the task that confronted me. "Yes, under his arm. Did you see? Yeah, He's gotta be stitched up or clamped or something. We've gotta stop the blood. He's lost too much already." The blackened, ash-covered remains of the medical kit were grouped on a piece of canvas in front of my knees. I found a suture needle, a rusty mechanic's pliers, and some silk thread. Freezing cold on the snowy ground, and with my bare hands cramped, I ran stitches into the artery and the flesh, and the whole area, desperate to lock off the gush of hot, red blood. The thread snagged several times. My stiffened fingers trembled. The man was awake and aware, and in terrible pain. He screamed and howled intermittently, but returned always to his prayer. My eyes were full of sweat, despite the shivering cold, when I nodded to Mahmoud to release the tourniquet. Blood oozed through the stitches. It was a much slower flow, but I knew the trickle would still kill him in the long run. I began to pack wads of bandage into the wound and then to wind on a pressure dressing, but Mahmoud's bloody hands seized my wrists in a powerful grip. I looked up to see that Zahra Rasul had stopped praying and stopped bleeding. He was dead. I was breathing hard. It was the kind of breathing that does more harm than good. I suddenly realized that I hadn't eaten for too many hours, and I was very hungry. With that thought, hunger, food, I felt sick for the first time. I felt the sweaty wave of nausea surge over me, and I shook my head free of it. When we returned our attention to the burned man, we found that he, too, had succumbed. I covered the still body with a canvas camouflage drop sheet. My last glimpse of his scorched, featureless, melted face became a prayer of thanks. One of the agonizing truths for a battle medic is that you pray as hard and almost as often for men to die as you pray for them to live. The third wounded man was Mahmoud Melbaf himself. There were tiny gray-black fragments of metal and what seemed to be melted plastic in his back, his neck, and the back of his head. Fortunately, The spray of that hot material had only penetrated the upper layers of his skin, much like splinters. Nevertheless, it was the work of an hour to rid him of them. I washed the wounds and applied antibiotic powder, dressing them wherever it was possible. We checked our supplies and reserves. We'd had 2 goats at the start of the attack. One of them had run off, and we never sighted it again. The other was found cowering in a blind alcove formed between high, rocky escarpments. That goat was our only food. The flour had burned to soot with the rice and ghee and sugar. The fuel reserves were completely exhausted. The stainless steel medical instruments had suffered a direct hit, and most of them had deformed into useless lumps of metal. I scraped through the wreckage to retrieve some antibiotics, disinfectants, ointments, bandages, suture needles, thread, syringes, and morphine ampules. We had ammunition and some medicines, and we could melt the snow to make water, but the lack of food was a very serious concern. We were 9 men. Suleiman and Khalid decided that we had to leave the camp. There was a cave on another mountain, about 12 hours' march away to the east, which they hoped might give us adequate protection from attack. The Russians were sure to have another helicopter in the air within a few hours at most. Ground forces wouldn't be far behind. Every man filled 2 canteens with snow, and keep them inside his clothes, next to his body, on the march, Khalid said to me, translating Suleiman's orders. We carry weapons, ammunition, medicines, blankets, some fuel, some wood, and the goat. Nothing else. Let's go. We left on the march with empty stomachs, and that state defined us for the next 4 weeks as we hunkered down in the new mountain cave. One of Jalalad's young friends, Hanif, had been a halal butcher in his home village. He slaughtered, skinned, gutted, and quartered the goat when we arrived. We prepared a fire with wood that we'd carried from the ruined camp, and a sprinkle of spirit from one of the lamps. The meat was cooked, every last morsel, except for the parts, such as the legs of the animal below the knee joint, which were regarded as haram, or forbidden for Muslims to eat. The carefully cooked meat was then rationed into small daily shares. We stored the bulk of the cooked flesh in an improvised refrigerator scooped out of the ice and snow. And then, for 4 weeks, we nibbled at the dry meat and cringed inwardly as hunger twisted us around the craving for more. It was an expression of our discipline and good-natured support for one another that the meat from one goat kept 9 men alive for 4 weeks. We tried many times to slip away from the camp and reach one of the neighboring kells to secure some extra food. But all the local villages were occupied by enemy troops, and the entire mountain range was surrounded by patrols of Afghan army units led by Russians. Habib's tortures had combined with the damage we'd done to the helicopter to rouse a furious determination in the Russians and Afghan regulars. On one foraging mission, our scouts heard an announcement echoing through the nearest valley. The Russians had attached a loudspeaker to a military jeep. An Afghan, speaking in Pashto, described us as bandits and criminals, and said that a special task force had been set up to capture us. They'd put a reward on our heads. Our scouts wanted to shoot at the vehicle, but they thought it might be a trap designed to draw us out of hiding. They let it pass, and the words of the hunters echoed in the sheer, stone canyons like the howl of prowling wolves. Apparently acting on false information, or perhaps following the trail of Habib's bloody executions, the Russians, working from all the surrounding villages, concentrated their searches on another mountain range to the north of us. For so long as we remained in our remote cave, we seemed to be safe. So we waited, trapped and hungering and afraid, through the 4 coldest weeks of the year. We hid, creeping through shadows in the daylight hours, and huddled together without light or heat in the darkness every night. And slowly, one ice-edged hour at a time, the knife of war whittled the wishing and hoping away until all that was left to us, within the hard, disconsolate wrap of our own arms around our own shivering bodies, was the lonely will to survive. Chapter 36. I couldn't face the loss of Qadrbai, my father dream. I'd helped to bury him, for God's sake, with my own hands. But I didn't grieve, and I didn't mourn him. There wasn't enough truth in me for that kind of sorrowing because my heart wouldn't believe him dead. I'd loved him too much, it seemed to me in that winter of war, for him to simply be gone, to be dead. If so much love could vanish into the earth and speak no more, smile no more, then love was nothing. And I wouldn't believe that. I was sure there had to be a payoff, somehow, and I kept waiting for it. I didn't know then, as I do now, that love's a one-way street. Love, like respect, isn't something you get, it's something you give. But not knowing that in those bitter weeks, not thinking that, I turned from the hole in my life where so much loving hope had been, and I refused to feel the longing or the loss. I cringed within the bleak, concealing camouflage of snow and shadowed stone. I chewed the leathered fragments of goat's meat left to us. And each minute crammed with heartbeats and hunger dragged me further from the grieving and the truth. Eventually, of course, we exhausted the supply of meat, and a meeting was called to discuss our options. Jalalad and the younger Afghans wanted to make a run for it, to fight our way through enemy lines, and strike out for the desert region of Zabul province, close to the Pakistan border. Suleiman and Khalid reluctantly agreed that there was no other option, but they wanted clear intelligence of the enemy disposition before choosing where to launch a breakout attack. To that end, Suleiman sent young Hanif on a scouting mission that would take him on a sweeping curve from the southwest to the north and southeast of our position. He ordered the young man to return within 24 hours and to travel only at night. It was a long, cold, hungry wait for Hanif to return. We were drinking water, but that only staved off the torment for a few minutes and left us even hungrier. 24 hours stretched to 2 days, and then into a third, with no sign of him. On the morning of the third day, we accepted that Hanif was dead or captured. Juma, a cameleer from the tiny Tajik enclave in the southwest of Afghanistan near Iran, volunteered to search for him. He was a dark, thin-faced man with a hawk-like nose and a thickly emotive mouth. He was close to Hanif and Jalalad, the closeness that men in wars and prisons find, against their every expectation, and rarely express in words or gestures. Juma's Tajik clans of cameleers were traditional rivals of the Mohmand Hazarbuz people of Hanif and Jalalad in the nomadic transport of trade goods. The competition between the groups had become intense as Afghanistan rapidly modernized. In 1920, fully 1 in every 3 Afghans was a nomad. Just 2 generations later, by 1970, only 2% of the people were nomads. Rivals though they were, the 3 young men had been thrown into close cooperation with one another by the war, and they'd become inseparable friends. Their friendship had developed in the insidiously dull months that troughed between the peaks of fighting, and was tested many times in combat. In their most successful battle, they'd used landmines and grenades to destroy a Russian tank. Each of them wore, on a leather thong around his neck, a small piece of metal taken from the tank as a souvenir. When Juma declared that he would search for Hanif, we all knew that we couldn't prevent him from doing it. With a weary sigh, Suleiman agreed to let him go. Refusing to wait until nightfall, Juma shouldered his weapon and crept from the camp at once. He'd gone without food for 3 days, just as we had, but the smile that he sent back to Jalalad, as he looked over his shoulder for the last time, was bright with strength and courage. We watched him leave, watched his thin, retreating shadow sweep the sundial of the snowy slopes beneath us. Hunger exaggerated the cold. It was a long, hard winter, with snow falling on the mountains around us every other day. The temperature fluttered above zero during the daylight hours, but sank into icy, teeth-chattering sub-zero levels from dusk until well after dawn. My hands and feet were constantly cold, achingly cold. The skin on my face was wooden, and as riven with cracks as the feet of the farmers in Prabaker's village. We pissed on our hands, to fight off the aching sting of the cold, and it helped to bring feeling back to them momentarily. But we were so cold that taking a piss was a serious issue. First there was the dread inspired by having to open our clothes at all, and then there was the chill that followed the release of a bladder of warm fluid. Losing that warmth caused the body temperature to drop quickly, and we always put it off until the last moment. Juma failed to return that night. At midnight, with hunger and fear prodding us awake, we all jumped at a little crickle of sound in the darkness. 7 guns aimed at the spot. Then we gasped as a face loomed from the shadows, much closer than we'd expected. It was Habib. "What are you doing, my brother?" Khalid asked him gently, in Urdu. "You gave us a big fright." "They are here," he answered in a rational, calm voice that seemed to rise from another mind or another place, as if he was a medium speaking in a trance. His face was filthy. We were all unwashed and bearded, but Habib's filth was something so repulsive and thickly smeared that it was shocking. Like poison pouring from an infected wound, the foulness seemed to squeeze outward through the pores of his skin from some feculence deep within. "They are everywhere, all around you." And they are coming up to here to get you, to kill you all, when more men come, tomorrow, or the day after that. Soon. They know where you are. They will kill you all. There is only one way out of here now. How did you find us here, brother? Khalid asked, his voice as calm and remote as Habib's. I came with you. I have always been near you. Did you not see me? My friends, Jalalad asked, Juma and Hanif. Did you see them anywhere? Habib didn't reply. Jalalad asked the question again, more forcefully. Did you see them? Were they in the Russian camp? Were they captured? We listened in a silence thick with our fear and the poisonous smells of decayed flesh that clung to Habib. He seemed to be meditating, or perhaps listening to something no one else could hear. Tell me, Baki Kaka, Suleiman asked gently, using the familiar term for nephew, what did you mean? There is only one way out of here now. They are everywhere, Habib answered, his face deformed by its wide-mouthed, psychotic stare. Mahmoud Melbaf was translating for me, whispering close to my ear. They don't have enough men. They have mined all the easiest ways out of the mountains. The north, the east, the west, all mined. Only the southeast is clear, because they think you will not try to escape that way. They left that way clear, so they can come up here to get you. We can't go out that way, Mahmoud whispered to me when Habib stopped suddenly. The Russians, they hold the valley southeast of here. It is their way to Kandahar. When they come for us, they will come from that direction. If we go that way, we will all die, and they know it. Now, they are in the southeast. But for tomorrow, for one day, they are all on the far side of the mountain, in the northwest, Habib said. His voice was still calm and composed, but his face was a gargoyle's leer, and the contrast unnerved us all. Only a few of them stay here tomorrow. Only a few will stay, while the rest of them put the last mines on the northwest slopes, just after dawn. If you run at them, attack them, fight them tomorrow, in the southeast, there will only be a few of them. You can break through and escape. But only tomorrow. How many are they altogether? Jalalad asked. 68 men. They have mortars, rockets, and 6 heavy machine guns. There are too many of them for you to sneak past them at night. But you sneaked past them, Jalalad insisted defiantly. They cannot see me, Habib replied serenely. I am invisible to them. They cannot see me until I am pushing my knife into their throats. That's ridiculous, Jalalad hissed at him. They are soldiers. You are a soldier. If you can get past them, we can do it. Did your men return to you? Habib asked him, turning his maniac stare on the young fighter for the first time. Jalalad opened his mouth to speak, but the words sank into the small heaving sea of his heart. He cast his eyes down, and shook his head. Could you enter this camp without being seen or heard, as I did? If you try to get past them, you will die, like your friends. You cannot get past them. I can do it, but you cannot. But you think we can fight our way out of here? Khalid put the question to him gently, quietly, but we all heard the urgency in it. You can. It is the only way. I have been everywhere on this mountain, and I have been so close to them that I can hear them scratch their skin. That is the reason why I am here. I came to tell you how to save yourselves. But there is a price for my help. All the ones you do not kill tomorrow, the ones who survive, they will be mine. You will give them to me. Yes, yes, Suleiman agreed soothingly. Come, Baki Kaka, tell us what you know. We want to share your knowledge. Sit with us, and tell us what you know. We have no food, so we cannot offer you a meal. I'm sorry. There is food, Habib interrupted, pointing beyond us to the shadows at the edge of our camp. I smell food there. True enough, the rotting pieces of the dead goat, the haram cuts from the animal, lay in a little heap in the slushy snow. Cold as it was, and even in the snow, the bits of raw meat had long begun to decay. We couldn't smell them from that distance, but it seemed that Habib could. The madman's comment provoked a long discussion of the religious rights and wrongs of eating haram food. The men weren't rigid in the observation of their faith. They prayed every day, but not in strict adherence to the timetable of 3 sessions, ordained by Shia Islam, or the 5 sessions of the Sunni Muslims. They were good men of faith, rather than overtly religious men. Nevertheless, in a time of war, and with the great dangers we faced, the last power they wanted ranged against them was God's. They were holy warriors, mujahideen. men who believed that they would become martyrs at the instant that they died in battle, and that they were assured a place in the heavens, where beautiful maidens would attend them. They didn't want to pollute themselves with forbidden foods when they were so close to the martyr's rush for paradise. It was a tribute to their faith, in fact, that the mere discussion of the haram meat hadn't occurred until we'd hungered for a month and then starved for 5 days. For my part, I confessed to Mahmoud Melbath that I'd been thinking about the discarded meat almost constantly for the last few days. I wasn't a Muslim, and the meat wasn't forbidden to me. But I'd lived so closely with the fighters, and for so many painful weeks, that I'd linked my fate to theirs. I would never have eaten anything while they hungered. I wanted to eat the meat, but only if they agreed and ate it with me. Suleiman delivered the decisive opinion on the matter. He reminded the men that while it was indeed evil for a Muslim to eat haram food, it was an even greater evil for a Muslim to starve himself to death when haram food was available to be eaten. The men decided that we would cook the rotting meat in a soup before the first light. Then, fortified by that meal, we would use Habib's information on the enemy positions to fight our way out of the mountains. During the long weeks of hiding and waiting without heat or hot food, we'd entertained and supported one another with the stories we'd told. On that last night, after several others had spoken, it was my turn once more. For my first story, weeks before, I told them about my escape from prison. Although they'd been scandalized by my admissions about being a guna, or sinner, and being imprisoned as a criminal, they'd been thrilled by the account, and asked many questions afterwards. My second story had been about the night of the assassins. How Abdullah, Vikram, and I had tracked the Nigerian killers down. How we'd fought with them, defeated them, and then expelled them from the country. How I'd hunted Maurizio, the man who'd caused it all, and beat him with my fists. And how I'd wanted to kill him, but had spared his life, only to regret that pity when he'd attacked Lisa Carter and forced Ulla to kill him. That story, too, had been very well received, and as Mahmoud Melbath took his place beside me to translate my third story, I wondered what might capture their enthusiasm anew. My mind scanned its list of heroes. There were many, so many men and women, beginning with my own mother, whose courage and sacrifice inspired the memory of them. But when I began to speak, I found myself telling Prabaker's story. The words, like some kind of desperate prayer, came unbidden from my heart. I told them how Prabaker had left his village Eden for the city when he was still a child, how he'd returned as a teenager, with the wild street boy Raju and other friends to confront the menace of the dacoits, how Rukmabai, Prabaker's mother, had put courage into the men of the village, how young Raju had fired his revolver as he walked toward the boastful leader of the dacoits until the man fell dead, how Prabaker had loved feasting and dancing and music, how he'd saved the woman he loved from the cholera epidemic, and married her, and how he died, in a hospital bed, surrounded by our sorrowing love. After Mahmoud finished translating the last of my words, there was a lengthy silence while they considered the tale. I was just convincing myself that they were as moved by the life of my little friend as I was myself when the first questions began. So, how many goats did they have in that village? Suleiman asked gravely. He wants to know how many goats. Mahmoud began translating. I got it, I smiled. Well, near as I can tell, about 80, maybe as many as 100. Each household had about 2 or 3 goats, but some had as many as 6 or 8. That information inspired a little gesticulating buzz of discussion that was more animated and partisan than any of the political or religious debates that had occasionally stirred among the men. What color were these goats? Jalalad asked. The colors, Mahmoud explained solemnly. He wants to know the colors of those goats. Well, gee, they were brown, I guess, and white, and a few black ones. Were they big goats, like the ones in Iran? Mahmoud translated for Suleiman. Or were they skinny, like the ones in Pakistan? Well, about so big. I suggested, gesturing with my hands. How much milk, Nazir asked, caught up in the discussion in spite of himself, did they get from those goats, every day? I'm not really an expert on goats. Try, Nazir insisted. Try to remember. Oh, shit. It's just a wild stab in the dark, mind you, but I'd say, maybe, a couple of liters a day. I offered, raising the palms of my hands helplessly. This friend of yours, how much did he earn as a taxi driver? Suleiman asked. Did this friend go out with a woman, alone, before his marriage? Jalalad wanted to know, causing all the men to laugh and some of them to throw small stones at him. In that way the session moved through all the themes that concerned them, until at last I excused myself and found a relatively sheltered spot where I could stare at the misty nothing of the frozen, shrouded sky. I was trying to fight down the fear that prowled in my empty belly, and leapt up with sharp claws at my heart in its cage of ribs. Tomorrow. We were going to fight our way out. No one had said it, but I knew that all the others were thinking we would die. They were too cheerful, too relaxed. All the tension and dread of the last weeks had drained from them once we'd made the decision to fight. It wasn't the joyful relief of men who know they're saved. It was something else. Something I'd seen in the mirror, in my cell, on the night before my desperate escape from prison, and something I'd seen in the eyes of the man who'd escaped with me. It was the exhilaration of men who were risking everything, risking life and death, on one throw of the dice. Sometime on the next day we would be free, or we would be dead. The same resolution that had sent me over the front wall of a prison was sending us over the ridge, and into the enemy guns. It's better to die fighting than to die like a rat in a trap. I'd escaped from prison, and crossed the world, and crossed the years, to find myself in the company of men who felt exactly as I did about freedom and death. And still I was afraid. Afraid of being wounded, afraid of being shot in the spine and paralyzed, afraid of being captured alive and tortured in another prison by yet another prison guard. It occurred to me that Carla and Cotterby would have had something clever to say to me about fear. And in thinking that, I realized how remote they were from the moment, and the mountain, and me. I realized that I didn't need their brilliance anymore. It couldn't help me. All the cleverness in all the world couldn't stop my stomach from nodding around its prowling fear. When you know you're going to die, there's no comfort in cleverness. Genius is vain, and cleverness is hollow, at the end. The comfort that does come, if it comes at all, is that strangely marbled mix of time and place and feeling that we usually call wisdom. For me, on that last night before the battle, it was the sound of my mother's voice, and it was the life and death of my friend Prabaker. God give you rest, Prabaker. I still love you, and the grieving, when I think of you, is pinned to my heart and my eyes with bright and burning stars. My comfort, on that freezing ridge, was the memory of Prabaker's smiling face, and the sound of my mother's voice. Whatever you do in life, do it with courage, and you won't go far wrong. Here, take one, Khaled said, sliding down beside me to squat on his heels, and offering me one of 2 half-cigarettes that he held in his bare hand. Jesus, I gawked. Where'd you get those? I thought we all ran out last week. We did, he said, lighting the cigarettes with a small gas lighter. Except for these. I kept them for a special occasion. I think this is it. I got a bad feeling, Lynn. A real bad feeling. It's inside me, and I can't shake it tonight. It was the first time that we'd spoken more than the essential word or two since the night that Cater had left. We'd worked and slept side by side, every day and night, but I almost never met his eye, and I'd avoided conversation with him so coldly that he, too, had been silent with me. Look, Khaled, about Cater and Carla, don't feel. I mean, I'm not. No, he interrupted. You had plenty of reason to be mad. I can see it from your side. I always could. You got a raw deal, and I told Cater that, too, on the night he left. He should have trusted you. It's a funny thing. The guy he trusted most, the only guy in the whole world he really trusted all the way, turned out to be a crazy killer, and the one who sold us all out. The New York accent, with its Arabic swell, rolled over me like a warm, frothy wave, and I almost reached out to hug him. I'd missed the assurances I'd always found in the sound of that voice, and the honest suffering I saw in the scarred face. I was so glad to have his friendship again that I confused what he'd said about Cotterby. I thought, without really thinking at all, that he was talking about Abdullah. He wasn't, and that, too, like 100 other chances to know all the truth in the one conversation, was lost. How well did you know Abdullah? I asked him. Pretty well, he answered, his little smile becoming an asking frown. Where is this going? Did you like him? Not really. Why not? Abdullah didn't believe in anything. He was a rebel without a cause, in a world that doesn't have enough rebels for the real causes. I don't like, and I don't really trust, people who don't believe in anything. Does that include me? No, he laughed. You believe in a lot of things. That's why I like you. That's why Cater loved you. He did love you, you know. He told me so, a couple different times. What do I believe in? I scoffed. You believe in people, he replied quickly. That stuff with the slum clinic and all. The story you told the guys tonight, that about the village. You'd forget that shit if you didn't believe in people. That work in the slum, when the cholera went through the place. Cater loved that, what you did then, and so did I shit, for a while there. I think you even had Carla believing, too. You gotta understand, Lynn. If Cater had a choice, if there was a better way to do what he had to do, he would have taken it. It all played out the way it had to. Nobody wanted to fuck you over. Not even Carla? I smiled, savoring the last puff of the cigarette and then stubbing it out on the ground. Well, maybe Carla, he conceded, laughing the small, sad laugh. But that's Carla. I think the only guy she never fucked over was Abdullah. Were they together? I asked, so surprised that I couldn't help the pinch of jealousy that pulled my brows together in a hard, little frown. Well, you couldn't say together, he answered evenly, staring into my eyes. But I was, once. I used to live with her. You what? I lived with her, for 6 months. What happened? I asked, gritting my teeth and feeling stupid for it. I had no right to be angry or jealous. I'd never asked Carla about her lovers, and she'd never asked me about mine. You don't know, do you? I wouldn't ask, if I knew. She dumped me, he said slowly, just about the time you came along. Ah, fuck, man. It's okay, he smiled. We were silent for a moment, both of us reeling back through the years. I remembered Abdullah, at the seawall near the Haji Ali Mosque, on the night that I met him with Qadrbai. I remembered him saying that a woman had taught him the clever phrase he'd used in English. It must have been Carla. Of course it was Carla. And I remembered the stiffness that was in Khalid's manner when I first met him, and I realized, suddenly, that he must have been hurting then, and maybe blaming me for it. I saw clearly what it must have taken for him to be as friendly and kind to me as he was at the beginning. You know, he added after a while, you really got to go careful with Carla, Lynn. She's angry, you know? And she's hurt. She's hurt bad, in all the places that count. They really fucked her up when she was a kid. She's a bit crazy. She did something, in the States, before she came to India. And that fucked her up, too. What did she do? I don't know. Something pretty serious. She never told me what it was. We talked around it, if you get my meaning. I think Qadrbai knew about it because, you know, he was the first one to meet her. No, I didn't know that, I answered him, frowning with the thought of how little I knew about the woman I'd loved for so long. Why do you think she never told me about Qadrbai? I knew her a long time, when we were both working for him, and she didn't say a word. I talked about him, but she never said a word. She didn't mention his name once. I think she's just loyal to him, you know? I don't think there's anything against you, Lynn. She's just incredibly loyal. Well, she was incredibly loyal to him. She thought of him like a father, I think. Her own father died when she was a kid. And her stepfather died when she was still pretty young. Cater came along just in time to save her, so he got to be her father. You said he was the first one who met her? Yeah, on a plane. It's kind of a weird story, the way she told me. She didn't remember getting on the plane. She was running from something she did, and she was in trouble. She ended up going on a few different planes from different airports, for a few days, I think. And then she was on this plane that was going to Singapore from, I don't know, somewhere. And she must have had, like, a nervous breakdown or something, because she cracked up, and the next thing she knew, she was in this cave, in India, with Qadrbai. And then he left her with Ahmed, who looked after her. She told me about him. Did she? She doesn't talk about it much. She liked that guy. He nursed her for near about 6 months until she got herself together again. He brought her back, into the light, like. They were pretty close. I think he was the closest thing to a brother she ever knew. Were you with her? I mean, did you know her then, when he was killed? I don't know that he was killed, Lynn, Khalid stated, frowning hard as the knot of recollections turned in his memory. I know Carla believes it. That Madame Jo killed him, and the girl. Christine. Yeah, Christine. But I knew Ahmed pretty well. He was a very gentle guy, a very simple, soft kind of a guy. He was just the type to take poison with his girlfriend, like in a romantic movie, if he thought he couldn't ever be free with her. Cater looked into it, real close, because Ahmed was one of his guys, and he was sure Joe had nothing to do with it. He cleared her. But Carla wouldn't accept it? No, she didn't buy it. And coming on top of everything else, it really fucked her up. Did she ever tell you she loves you? I hesitated, partly from reluctance to surrender the little advantage I might have had over him if he believed that she did say it, and partly from loyalty to Carla, because it was her business, after all. In the end, I answered him. I had to know why he'd asked me the question. No. That's too bad, he said flatly. I thought you might be the one. The one? The one to help her, to break through, I guess. Something really bad happened to that girl. A lot of bad things happened to her. Cater made it worse, I think. How? He put her to work for him. He saved her when he met her, and he protected her from what she was scared of, back in the States. But then she met this guy, a politician, and he fell for her pretty hard. Cater needed the guy, so he got her to work for him, and I don't think she was cut out for it. What kind of work? You know how beautiful she is. Those green eyes, and that white skin. Ah, fuck, I sighed, remembering a lecture Cater had given me once, about the amount of crime in the sin, and the sin in the crime. I don't know what was in Cater's head, Khaled concluded, shaking his own head in doubt and wonder. It was, out of character, to say the least. I honestly don't think he saw it as damaging her. But she, kind of, froze up, inside. It was like her own father was getting her to do that shit. And I don't think she forgave him for it. But she was incredibly loyal to him, all the same. I never understood it. But that's how I got together with her. I saw all that happening, and I felt kind of sorry for her, if you know what I mean. After a while, one thing led to another. But I never really got through to her. And you didn't, neither. I don't think anyone will. Ever. Ever is a long time. Okay, you got a point. But I'm just trying to warn you. I don't want you to get hurt anymore, brother. We've been through too much, nah? And I don't want her to get hurt. He fell silent again. We stared at the rocks and the frosty ground, avoiding one another's eyes. A few shivering minutes passed. At last he took a deep breath and stood up, slapping at the chill in his arms and legs. I stood as well, trembling with cold and stamping my numb feet. At the last possible moment, and with an impulsive rush as if he was breaking through a tangle of vines, Khaled flung his arms around me and hugged me. The strength in his arms was fierce, but his head slowly came to rest against mine as tenderly as the lolling head of a sleeping child. When he pulled away from me, his face was averted and I couldn't see his eyes. He walked off, and I followed more slowly, hugging my hands under my arms to fight off the cold. It was only when I was alone that I recalled what he'd said to me. I got a bad feeling, Lynn. A real bad feeling. I resolved to talk to him about it, but just at that moment Habib stepped out of a shadow beside me, and I jumped in fright. For fuck's sake, I hissed. You scared the fucking shit out of me. Don't do that shit, Habib. It's okay, Mahmoud Melbaf said, stepping up beside the madman. Habib garbled something at me, speaking so quickly that I couldn't make out a single clear syllable. His eyes were starting from his head. The effect was exaggerated by the dark, heavy pouches beneath his eyes, which dragged the lower lids with them and showed too much white below the fractured, scattered wheel of the iris. What? It's okay, Mahmoud repeated. He wants to talk with everybody. He talks to every man, tonight. He comes to me. He asks me to make it English for you, what he says. You are the last, before Khaled. He wants to speak to Khaled last. What did he say? Mahmoud asked him to repeat what he'd said to me. Habib did speak again, in exactly the same too rapid, hyper-energetic manner, staring into my eyes as if he expected an enemy or a monstrous beast to emerge from them. I was just as steadfast in returning the stare. I'd been locked up with violent, crazy men, and I knew better than to take my eyes off him. He says that strong men make the luck to happen, Mahmoud translated for us. What? Strong men, they make it for itself, the luck. Strong men make their own luck? Is that what he means? Yes, exactly so, Mahmoud agreed. A strong man can make his own luck. What does he mean? I do not know, Mahmoud replied, smiling patiently. He just says it. He's just going around, telling everybody this? I asked. That a strong man makes his own luck? No, for me, he said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a great soldier before he was a great teacher. For Jalalad, he said that the stars shine because they are full with secrets. It is different for every man. And he was in too much a hurry for telling us these things. It is very important for him. I do not understand, Lin. I think it is because we fight tomorrow morning. Was there anything else? I asked, mystified by the exchange. Mahmud asked Habib if there was anything else that he wanted to say. Holding the stare into my eyes, Habib rattled away in Pashto and Farsi. He says only that there is no such a thing as luck. He wants you to believe him. He says again that a strong man makes his own luck. I completed the translation for him. Well, tell him I appreciate the message. Mahmud spoke, and for a few moments Habib stared harder, searching in my eyes for a recognition or response that I couldn't give him. He turned and loped away with the stooped, crouching run that I found more chilling and alarming, somehow, than the more obvious, bulging madness in his eyes. Now what's